Start to work your way in small circles around to the edges. Now I'm not going to tamp these guys down all the way because I want to fold in my next layer right there.
And are you somehow being cognizant of the color? Like, are you trying to be careful at all, or you're just trying to direct?
So when you do this first layer, you want to be a little careful because you could dig into your color with your spoon as you're dumping it.
Yeah.
But I am not overly concerned. I can tamp really hard and it's not going to displace my color. Now you can see why it becomes important to have those sort of edge lines if you want this to be a specific shape. If you don't, that's fine. And just a little bit at a time. Try and work your way around. Now,
if you do, how do you refine the edges?
Yeah, so now as you come to the edge, it gets a little tricky because what you'll need to do is kind of scrape off the excess.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's important to not reuse this stuff. That's just sort of, it's a loss, which is okay. So we don't want to reapply anything from the table onto our model. So you'll scrape that away and then you're going to tamp in and down and in and down. And it's going to wiggle every time you do that. So it's going to be a little bit of a frustrating,
and pushing.
Yep, and the nicer you work that edge, the better it will be when you get it back. Now it might be that you want a kind of a loose, rough edge, and that's okay. You don't need to spend so much time over here. So that's kind of, I'll do that for the first once around. Once I've gone around once, I'm going to need to do another layer. So this is still not enough glass for us to have a really nice, solid piece of glass at the end. So this is a good example of what happens when you don't tamp and when you're a little thin. The glass kind of, we were talking earlier about wanting to be 6 millimeters. The glass kind of pulls together, and you can see how that affects the surface of it. You can pass that around. Whereas something like this was definitely at least 2 layers thick. Has a very different feel.
Now, can that be finished a little bit
Yes.
seamed?
Yes, you can. We got a. Ooh, hi. We've got a small stained glass grinder over here that will take that rough edge off somewhat.
Yeah, because I've got one of those at home when I put lenses.
We don't have enough time to show you like the belt sanders and stuff, but you can cold work this just like any other glass. And this edge has been almost completely finished.
So it's fused together enough that you could do that and it doesn't flake away.
Oh yeah, it's fused together enough that you can cut on a tile saw. Which is what this sample is here. So yeah, it's definitely one solid piece of glass. It's just that it's not hot enough that it's moving with gravity. And that edge is not finished at all. I think I just took a little bit of hand sanding and took off the little bits that would break off.
Glass grinder then.
Is this what you did on those beautiful things?
I just left the edges raw like that. Yeah.
So when we say that this is where you're at now?
Yeah, but that I just sort of threw some frit on top of it to demonstrate the
Okay. So this is 2 layers.
That's at least 2 layers. Some of you will need to do 3 layers. And now when you go to do your second layer, I'm sure you can see how it would get a little tricky to tell what's happening, right? If I put more glass on top of this, where does the glass begin and where does it end? So what you'll do is you're actually going to color your glass with food coloring.
Which will burn out, nobody will see it.
Which will burn out and nobody will be able to see it. And actually this is not green glass, this is just clear glass that's been dyed green. So a little drop of food coloring goes in there. You would need to mix up a little more than this, right? It's not enough glass, but that's okay. And then you're going to shake it. And it's going to change the color. Just of the frit today, not the frit when it comes out tomorrow. So the food coloring will burn away.
It's just as a guide for layering.
Absolutely. It's just a guide so that you know where you started the second layer and where you still need to put stuff on for the second layer.
Do you have to use clear, or can you use...
For today, we will be using clear.
But general?
In general, you do not need to use clear. But for today, we will use clear. And if you want to talk about changing the background color for the next project, we can talk about it. We won't ever use any solid glass off of that wall, but there are some ways to change the color of this using powder that we can discuss tomorrow. So there's my next color. It looks really nice. So I'm going to put this right over it, and you can see, okay, well, now I know, right? I've got,
cinnamon.
Yeah, I've got that second layer started. I don't know, it looks like.
So is this just so that you have it kind of equal layers?
Exactly, so that you know where you got enough and where you need to put a little more. So you'll do the same thing, tamp that down. What you're going to be looking for once you start to tap it is you want to stop seeing movement. So if I give this guy a tap now, It actually looks pretty good. This is not a good, bad example. But what I want to see is that when I tap it, I shouldn't see too much shifting happening anywhere else around my tool.
What's that indicate when it shifts?
That you have not compacted your glass enough. So what we're really trying to do is just sort of take all of those separate bits and compress them so that they're the closest to each other as we can get them. And that's what's going to give you that nice even backing when it goes to melt down.
Gotcha.
As, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I think I missed why you need to build it up in layers and why you need to keep track of your layers.
So it is when you start, it can be really challenging to get an even layer that is compressed enough so that it all melts evenly. So by doing it in a few separate layers, it's going to help ensure that you are the proper thickness all the way through the material. And it doesn't matter so much for this. We can have thick and thin spots on our tiles, but when it comes to a three-dimensional object, if you've got thick and thin spots on something that has walls, that can really impact whether or not your piece survives and whether or not it pulls apart, right? So this glass has to be 6 millimeters thicker. It'll start to pull apart, which maybe is fine if that's what you want, but we want to avoid it at the beginning at least. Does that make sense? Kind of?
The reason makes sense. What's not making sense to me yet is
Why can't you just put it all on there in one layer and then compress it?
I think that's part of it, and also how you're deciding where to put your second layer, because you didn't put it over the whole thing.
Yeah, I will though. I would though. Yeah, so I would do this all the way up to my edges, and then I would go back and I would do it all the way again up to the edges.
And you're dyeing it more or less just to make it easier to see it.
Exactly.
Because when you're using just the glass grid, you can't really tell.
If I put white on top of white, then you're not sure where your second layer started and where it ends. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, sorry, it is a little, I can see where that got confusing.
How do you know if you need a third one?
I will tell you.
Fair enough.
So, how do you know if you need a third layer? So what you'll see is that people, when they start these layers, they'll have different thicknesses, and that has to do with how hard you're tapping and how evenly you're applying it. So if you are not very even with your tamping, you will need more glass. If you are nice and meticulous and even with your tamping, you'll probably only need 2 layers. And what we're going to look for is something that is, where is my, can you pass me a needle tool? There should be maybe one over there.
Got some fairly pointy things, but I don't think I have
Okay, that'll work. That's perfect. So what you want to see is something that, I want it to be twice that thick. So probably a layer of glass that's about that thick. What is that? Maybe a 1/4 of an inch? Pushing a half an inch?
That's like
half an inch? Yeah, so, and it's going to look quite a bit thicker before it goes into the kiln. Once it's fired, it's going to be about
So we
that
have to
6
tamp all our
millimeters.
layers till it's that thick.
You are going to tamp 2 layers until it's about that thick. Yeah.
Is that going from your recessed layer or from it?
No, it's going from your background layer. Very good
okay,
question.
Good question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how thick is something like this?
How thick is it right now, or how thick would it fire to?
Well, no, how thick is it now?
Maybe 1/8 of an inch.
Yeah, it's
Yeah, it was
like
about
2
half
millimeter.
of it.
So is that about how thick these started off then? They started off at about like half an
Yeah.
inch deep,
And then
it
when they're
reduced down
fired,
to
they.
like 1/8 of an inch.
Yep. And so part of what you're trying to do by tamping is kind of compress that glass so that you get an accurate read on what you're looking at.
Yeah, but you're still going to see at least a 50% reduction.
Right,
in thickness.
right.
Okay.
But it's much more consistent than mixing up your frit and just dumping it on there.
Yeah,
You know what I mean.
I'm just
Yeah.
I'm just wondering what to expect in terms of how much.
Yeah, you'll
It
lose a lot of
collapses.
volume.
Yeah.
Okay, everybody good with that so far? Okay. So I would have to do the same thing to my edge that we talked about earlier, where you're in and then down and in and then down. If something goes horribly awry, you can take this over to the sink and rinse it all off, which is actually what I'm going to do to this in a minute. So it all just goes right into, have you been to the sink? Did you see how there is a bucket there? It's going to catch all of our frit so none of it goes down the drain. And we'll toss that at the end. couple of important things to notice. Housekeeping becomes really important at this point. You want to make sure that you do not take any of this glass, even though it looks usable, that does not go back onto your plaster because it is probably contaminated. And I have a really good contaminated sample over here. So this is a really good example of what not to do. Don't use dirty glass. So if I hold this up to the light, you can see all of that brown is from, so this was all just sort of table, this is my bad sample. It's all just frit that's taken off of the table, and we were using clay that day, so the clay ends up all kind of in there discoloring your clear frit.
Wow.
And I think if you take a look at some of these samples, that one in the middle with the circles, the plaster will stay in the glass as well. If you flip it over and look on the back side, you'll see some white dots. And this one's got a piece of metal flake in it too. So just make sure that when you're doing this, that you're not pulling anything off of the table. That all just goes right into the garbage.
How do you avoid having the plaster in?
Yeah, so you just don't use any of this. All this stuff, you're done. It's
And
done.
make sure your mold's clean.
And make sure your mold's clean, and make sure that you don't have any loose bits of plaster on your table or on your actual bat. And most likely we'll probably have a few people with a few little white specks. It's not really, I don't find it to be super distracting. I just want you to know how to avoid it. Additionally, if you want these to hang, you could, if you so choose, put a copper hook onto them. So I just laid a little copper hook on top of my final layer of glass, and I put a tiny piece of clear glass over that. This is copper, so it will react with any sulfur colors. So if you have yellow going all the way up to the edge, where this, even though this was on top of my clear, that copper is strong enough or powerful enough that it would discolor the yellow if this had a yellow surface.
There's a wire you can use. Is it Canthol wire or something like that?
Nichrome, maybe?
Non-reactive? Yeah, maybe that's it. I've seen it used
Mm-hmm.
in people doing plaster, or not plaster, porcelain tiles,
Mm-hmm.
which are real high fire. Like,
Yeah. You know, I don't know if that would be compatible with the glass. It's less of the
Oh.
temperature issue and more of the expanding and contracting as it cools.
Oh.
So copper, gold, and silver are all fine to put into glass, and platinum, if you could afford it, I guess. And you know, I have seen some people get away with other things. Doesn't necessarily mean that
silver's not that
you'll
expensive
get away
right
from
now,
it.
so-
Yeah, well, there you go.
So, yeah.
Melting point.
If you don't
might
like
be an
copper.
issue, though.
Why? This is fired at what, 1400?
1410, maybe 1450.
Yeah, most silver's like at
Yeah, 1700.
17, 19, depending, yeah, so.
So those aren't clear glass, those are white opaque, right?
This is white, yeah. The background for this one is white. Everything else on the table, though, is clear.
Oh,
Yeah, those are all. This is the clear
As
back.
clear as it's
Clear,
gonna
clear,
get.
and clear.
Yeah.
Yep.
okay.
But you can see how this looks a little different.
Yeah, yeah.
And it doesn't affect your kiln if you put metal in it. You can just.
It should not affect your kiln to put metal in it. It could affect your kiln to put wet plaster into it, though. Yeah. So you could either let these. We're gonna fire them wet because we don't have enough time. But if you were at home, you might want to leave these to sit for a week or so and let some of that water leave the kiln, leave the plaster before you put it in your
And
kiln.
then can you do something like leave the
Vent
kiln
it.
up, vent
Yeah,
it for
absolutely.
a half hour or an hour?
Yeah, yeah. Those are all good things to
like
do.
500 to
400 is typically where I remove most of the water
Okay.
from my mold. And we'll talk about firing schedules tomorrow.
So would you let it sit for a week before you decorated it? Or you
No,
decorate it
no,
now?
I would decorate it while it's wet.
Okay.
And once I'm completely finished, I would let it sit before I put it into my own kiln. And that's just because that water vapor is hurts your kiln.
But it won't affect the glasses adhesion to the mold.
It will not. Once all of your stuff is on there. Yeah. Because when this dries, it'll actually be a little bit, because it's got that gum arabic in it, it's going to be kind of sticky.
Yeah, I'm just a little surprised because when you wet pack enamel, you need to let it dry out before you stick it in the kiln because
Otherwise, you'll get air or something.
it tends not to fuse to the copper
Interesting.
very well.
Well, we don't want this to stick to our mold. We just want it to stick to itself. So maybe
Yeah.
that's the difference.
Could be.
Okay. Any other questions? Those are all really good.
to just recap. So we need a
Yes.
glass of the fluid mixed with water.
Yes. So it should look like skim milk.
We need a cup of water.
You need a cup of water to rinse your brushes.